Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be discussing the 2024 Democratic primaries in detail and the possibility of Joe Biden cancelling his campaign and instead endorsing another candidate. Now this has been widely speculated over the last 2 or 3 days by both CNN and a number of other sources. There have been discussions of Joe Biden's age and cognitive ability impairing his ability to lead and his unpopularity affecting the potential of his campaign. With that said, people have cited Lyndon Johnson's and Harry Truman's original campaigns to be re-elected, ending and them later endorsing other candidates. And in the same fashion, Joe Biden could cancel his campaign despite announcing that he's already running, and instead endorse another candidate. Now, whether or not this is going to happen is still unclear, but this video will discuss the hypothetical scenario by which it does, which candidate will win or be successful in being nominated, and whether they will win the national election. And with that, let's begin. So I'm up here on the 2024 Democratic primaries Wikipedia page. Now, as you can see, it's fairly small because the incumbent president is running again, which means that not many people are going to go against him. But of course, we have RFK Jr. and Marianne Williamson. Now, I discussed both Marianne Williamson and RFK Jr. in my 2024 video, but I'll quickly brush them off and say that if Joe Biden doesn't run, neither RFK Jr. or Marianne Williamson are going to be able to beat the opposition that they have. RFK Jr. is far too conservative and controversial for most of the Democratic base to get behind, and Marianne Williamson is simply seen as not having enough clout. Instead, there are 3 candidates in particular that I'm going to discuss that I believe have the ability to win the nomination. If we look back on the 2020 Democratic primaries, we can see this is a very large and open field. This is partly because the Democratic Party lacked real leadership after their loss in 2016, and only through Joe Biden, who had an extensive political career and a moderate record, were they able to gain a leading figure that they could all get behind. Now, originally Bernie Sanders was speculated to be the candidate, and that's who I'm going to talk about first. Bernie Sanders has a record of perhaps being the most progressive person in the congressional system. He is actually an independent senator from Vermont. What a lot of people don't realize is he's not a Democratic. He usually bids with the Democratic Party and votes in line with them, but will usually push for what he calls democratic socialism. He's discussed in detail what he believes it represents and the characteristics of a socialist democracy which he has promoted. He supports welfare checks, he supports universal health care, police reform, as well as promoting labour unions and workers' rights. As you can see, he's recently become chair of the Senate Health, Education, Labour and Pensions Committee, and he also has a fairly extensive political career dating back to the 1980s. The problem with Bernie Sanders, and the reason that he was controversial throughout both his 2016 campaign and 2020 campaign, is he has a fairly populist rhetoric that coincides with that of Donald Trump. Despite having fairly polar opposite viewpoints, his rhetoric is similar to that of a relatable and anti-bureaucratic style of leadership. As you can see in his picture here, he's not wearing a tie. You will rarely see him wearing a suit that's not disheveled or having his hair combed. And he's even older than Joe Biden by over a year, so he's seen as someone who isn't very formal. Hence, he lost his bid in the 2020, and I believe if he were to run again in an open Democratic primary, he would lose again, but not by much. It would be very close. Next, we have someone who is widely discussed as the presumptive nominee if Joe Biden doesn't run again, the incumbent Vice President, Kamala Harris. She was seen when Joe Biden ran in 2020, it was widely speculated that he would only run for 1 term, and that Kamala Harris would succeed him in taking on the nomination in 2024 to appeal to a younger, more diverse generation as the first black woman running for president. She has again a very progressive record, so your standard left-wing Democrat. However, her popularity has been decreasing exponentially ever since her election to the vice presidency, as she is widely seen to be a fairly uncharismatic public speaker and is well known for making gaffes and is unrelatable as a person. She also accidentally touted an alliance with North Korea at a press conference. So she's seen as someone who isn't very charismatic and who is very unpopular and who is even more unpopular than Joe Biden as a result of this. Therefore, I do not believe, despite her being the incumbent vice president, that she would win an open primary in 2024. And finally, we have Gavin Newsom, the incumbent governor of California. perhaps the most renowned and widely speculated Democratic candidate to succeed Joe Biden. If he were to run, he would be very young compared to his opponents, being only at the age of 55. He's younger than Kamala Harris, he's much younger than Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, and he's seen as someone who can be fairly charismatic. Now, as governor of California, and he is the incumbent governor, he's been fairly popular, considering that he successfully took down a recall election and was re-elected in 2022. Now, it's widely agreed upon that he's progressive in both his views on universal background checks and transgender rights. However, it's also understood that he has a more moderate or conservative viewpoint than that of his other Democratic legislatures in California. Now, as we can see here from this article by Cal Matters, Gavin Newsom has taken a much more moderate to conservative stance than some of his constituents, and as well as his predecessor and governor to which he served as lieutenant, Jerry Brown. Now, his opponent in a national election would likely tout him as a far-left radical. However, this information would likely deter that fact and convince primary voters that he is the most electable candidate. And with that, I believe that if an open Democratic primary were to occur in 2024 without Joe Biden, Gavin Newsom would be the nominee. With that in mind, let's head over to the national election, by which we have Gavin Newsom against Donald Trump, former president and incumbent California governor. Now, in regards to who Gavin would choose as his running mate, I would argue Elizabeth Warren would be a strong choice, considering she made a very prominent outshowing in 2020 in the Democratic primaries, and she's also a woman, she has an extensive political career, and she would also help shore up support in the 2024 primaries if it is an open one. So I would argue that would be the ticket. Now, I've allocated each party here the states that they will win without a doubt, and I've also put swing states in as regular. So I'm going to start allocating some states to both candidates, by which I think they will win. Now, we first have to discuss the different policies that Trump and Newsom will. Newsom would likely advocate for a moderate or regular Democratic platform of increasing background checks on assault weapons, promoting civil rights causes, especially in police reform, continuing to assist Ukraine in the war against Russia, and promote election integrity. Trump, on the other hand, would likely promote the idea that Newsom is an extremist who promoted radical reform, especially in regards to transgender peoples in his state of California. With that in mind, I'm going to start by giving Michigan and Pennsylvania, as well as New Hampshire, to the Democrats, for the same reasons as I've outlined in previous videos, saying how I believe the 2022 midterms fared well for them in these states, and I think that the general population is still Democratic. With that in mind, I'm going to give Nevada to Gavin. Again, I believe that it is still a state that will go Democratic, but could lean Republican within the next decade or so. Now, remembering that this is Gavin Newsom versus Donald Trump, and as I've discussed in previous videos, Trump is very unpopular in Arizona and Georgia after the 2020 election events that transpired. So I do believe that Newsom will be able to win both of them very marginally, despite his very liberal record in regards to transgender rights, which both of these states will probably react negatively to. I believe that Trump won't be able to win them back. Unless that is, as I discussed in the previous video, a prominent no labels campaign is able to split the anti-Trump vote. But that is not taking that campaign into account in this video, as they've stated that they're only going to run if it's Joe Biden versus Trump, and they're both very close in the polls. Now, with this in mind, I can speculate that if Gavin Newsom were theoretically the nominee in 2024, he would win the national election, if he went up against Trump. If it was him versus DeSantis, it's another story, but I do believe that Gavin Newsom would take the victory in the electoral vote and therefore the presidency. However, in Wisconsin, I actually believe the opposite is going to happen. I believe Trump will get a swing in Wisconsin, which means that he will win that state if he goes up against Gavin Newsom. The reason I believe this is because Gavin Newsom is someone who appeals mainly to urban voters, having been the mayor of San Francisco for 7 years, and he's also someone who does not poll well in rural areas. And again, as I've mentioned in previous videos, Wisconsin is a state by which the rural vote is becoming much more prominent and powerful. Now, this is actually an interesting outcome. As you'll remember in my 2024 video, I said that Joe Biden would win Wisconsin. Despite Joe Biden, you would think, being less popular than Gavin Newsom, or having less likely to win the election than Newsom. Reason I believe that Wisconsin will go red is because of Newsom's unpopularity in rural areas. In comparison, Joe Biden has expanded infrastructure and broadband connection to rural towns, especially in the South. Therefore, I believe that he would have a better record there. Joe Biden is also generally someone who appeals to old dog Democrats, which there are a lot of in Wisconsin after Michael Dukakis and Walter Mondale's prominent outcomes in those states throughout the 1980s. And finally, there's North Carolina. North Carolina I am once again going to give to Trump, as Trump is not particularly unpopular there, and I don't believe that Gavin Newsom would be too popular there either. Again, it's a state where that I predict rural voters are going to become much more prominent, and as such will appeal to the Republican candidate. And I don't believe, for the same reason that he'll win Wisconsin, that he could flip North Carolina. And so with that, this is what I believe a Gavin Newsom versus Donald Trump election would look like in 2024. That is, if Joe Biden suspended his campaign and provided an opportunity to have an open primary for the Democratic primary, Bernie Sanders would lose narrowly, Kamala Harris would lose narrowly as a result of her lack of charisma and unpopularity as vice president, but Gavin Newsom would win both the nomination and the presidency in the national vote as a result of his popularity as California governor and his fairly moderate record, but also strong presence of charisma and youth. And so thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Thank you. Bye.